The two chairs I reserved in the front row stayed empty for the entire ceremony. I kept glancing over at them during the vows, expecting some miracle, some last-second rush through the doors, some breathless apology that I could believe. Nothing came. My parents were not stuck in traffic. They were not in a hospital. They were standing around a grill 40 minutes away, laughing at my cousin Danny's backyard barbecue, eating potato salad and drinking cold drinks while I walked down the aisle alone. That day, something I had been carrying for 31 years finally cracked open inside me. It was not just the hurt of two empty chairs. It was the recognition that those chairs had always been empty in the ways that mattered most. The only question left was what I was going to do now that I finally saw it clearly. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to sit with that image for just a moment. Two empty chairs, front row, your wedding day. Think about whether you would have kept your silence after something like that or whether you would have finally said enough. Stay with me because what Patricia did next was not loud, it was not cruel, and it was not fast, but it was permanent. My name is Patricia, and I want to tell you something that most people in my life expected me to keep quiet about forever. I was 31 years old on my wedding day. I had spent the better part of 3 years planning that day, saving money for it, dreaming about it in the small hours when everything else felt heavy. I had picked the venue, chosen the flowers, tasted 4 different caterers, and driven 2 states over to find the exact dress I saw in a magazine clipping I had kept since I was 22. I had done all of that largely alone because the people who were supposed to help me, the people who were supposed to care the most, had a long history of being somewhere else whenever I needed them. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what my wedding day meant, you have to understand what my family was like for most of my life. And to understand my family, you have to understand one central truth that took me an embarrassingly long time to accept. In my parents' world, there was a hierarchy. It was never written down. No one ever sat me down and explained it to me, but it was real and it shaped everything. I grew up in a mid-sized town in the Midwest. My parents, Gerald and Marion, were both from large families. My father had 2 brothers and a sister. My mother had 3 sisters and a brother. Every single one of those siblings had children, which meant I grew up surrounded by cousins. Family gatherings were big, loud, and constant. Easter, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, random summer weekends. There was always a reason to pile into someone's backyard or living room and eat too much food while the adults talked over each other. On the surface, this sounds warm. It sounds like the kind of childhood people romanticize, and parts of it were good. I am not going to pretend the whole thing was a nightmare because that would not be honest, and I have spent enough of my life being dishonest about my family to avoid the discomfort of looking at them clearly. Parts of it were genuinely good. There were moments of real joy. There were holidays I remember with actual warmth. But running underneath all of it, quiet and consistent as a current, was the fact that I was never the one who mattered most. That sounds dramatic when I say it plainly like that, but I am not saying it to be dramatic. I am saying it because it is the most accurate description of a dynamic that shaped my entire childhood and most of my adult life. My parents loved me, I believe that. I think they genuinely loved me in whatever way they understood love to work. But loving someone and prioritizing them are 2 different things, and my parents were deeply, consistently, almost pathologically devoted to prioritizing other people. Specifically, they were devoted to prioritizing my cousin Danny. Danny was my mother's sister Carol's son. He was 2 years older than me, which meant he was 33 at the time of my wedding. Danny grew up in the same town, went to the same school system, and spent roughly the same amount of time at family gatherings as I did. But from the time we were small children, the difference in how he was treated versus how I was treated was impossible to ignore. Danny was athletic. Danny was charming. Danny had a big smile and an easy laugh, and he had figured out very early in life that adults responded well to him when he performed for them. He was the kind of kid who made grandparents feel proud just by walking into the room. I was the other kind. I was quiet. I read too much. I asked questions that made adults shift uncomfortably in their seats. I was not performing for anyone, which meant I did not earn the same reward. My parents were not abusive people. I want to be very careful about that word because it has a S. Pacific meaning, and what happened to me was not that. What happened to me was subtler and in some ways harder to name. It was the steady, year after year experience of watching my accomplishments meet with polite acknowledgement while Danny's accomplishments were celebrated like events. It was the experience of asking for support and getting a distracted yes while Danny got the full attention of every adult in the room. It was the experience of existing inside a family where I was loved in theory but overlooked in practice over and over again for decades. When I got into college on a partial academic scholarship, my parents said that was great, honey, and went back to whatever they were doing. When Danny got a football scholarship to a state school the following year, my parents drove 3 hours to his signing ceremony and cried actual tears. I sat at home and thought about what it meant that I had already accepted this difference as normal. When I graduated with honors and got my first real job as a graphic designer at a small firm downtown, my parents said they were proud. They did not come to my graduation ceremony because they had already made plans to help Danny move into his new apartment that weekend. He had not asked them to come on that specific day. It just happened to coincide. and they chose to keep their plans with him rather than attend my graduation. I told myself it was not a big deal. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I had gotten very good at telling myself those things. I want to say something here that is important because I think a lot of people who grew up in situations like mine will recognize it. When you spend years being the overlooked one, you develop a very specific coping strategy. You minimize, you explain away the hurt. You find reasons why the other person's needs were more legitimate, why your parents had valid reasons, why you are probably making too much out of a small thing. You do this because the alternative, accepting that the people who were supposed to love you most consistently chose other people over you, is a pain that is very difficult to sit with. So you minimize, you explain, you stay quiet, you keep going. I kept going for a long time. I kept going through my early 20s when I built my career steadily and quietly while Danny bounced between jobs and needed financial help from the family on at least 3 separate occasions that I know of. I kept going when my parents, both of whom worked steadily, quietly helped Danny out those times without once asking me if I needed anything. I did not need financial help at that point, so in a practical sense it did not affect me. But it was one more data point in a pattern I was still refusing to name. I kept going when I met Marcus at 26. Marcus was a civil engineer, steady and thoughtful and genuinely kind in a way that felt foreign to me at first because I had not experienced a lot of it. He was the kind of person who remembered small things you mentioned months earlier. He was the kind of person who showed up. I fell in love with him with the kind of certainty that scared me a little because I had not felt certain about much before. My parents liked Marcus. I will give them that. They thought he was a good man, which he absolutely is. But even the way they responded to our relationship had that familiar quality of mild approval rather than genuine investment. When Marcus and I announced our engagement after 3 years together, my parents said congratulations and gave us a hug. My mother told her sister Carol that same day, and Carol called Danny, and somehow within 48 hours, the news of my engagement had become a conversational backdrop for whatever Danny was currently doing, which was, at that moment, apparently considering starting a catering business. We got engaged on a Saturday in October. By the following Thursday, the main topic at the family dinner my mother hosted was Danny's catering idea. I sat at that dinner table and smiled and passed dishes and thought, with the calm clarity of someone who has made peace with something, that this was simply how it was going to be. My engagement had become background noise in less than a week. I should not have been surprised. I was not surprised. I was just a little more tired than usual. Marcus noticed. He noticed the way I got quiet on the drive home. He noticed the way I changed the subject whenever he asked how I was feeling about the family dinner. Marcus was good at noticing, which was both a gift and a challenge because I had spent so long pretending I was fine that being seen clearly felt uncomfortable even by someone who loved me. He did not push that night, but a few days later he sat across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and said, "Patricia, I want to ask you something and I want you to actually answer it." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Does it hurt you the way your family responds to you versus duh?" And why? And I looked at my coffee for a long moment before I said yes. It hurts every time. I just do not let it show anymore because it does not change anything. Marcus put his hand over mine and said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "Things not changing does not mean you have to keep absorbing them silently." I did not have a response to that. I just nodded and changed the subject because I was not ready yet. I was not ready to stop absorbing. We planned our wedding over the course of 2.5 years. I know that sounds like a long engagement, but we were both busy building our careers and we wanted to save enough to have the wedding we actually wanted rather than a scaled-back version. I had a specific vision. It was not an extravagant vision. I did not want a ballroom or a celebrity DJ or a 12-tier cake. I wanted something warm and intimate. A restored barn venue about an hour outside the city that had floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed wood beams and string lights that made everything look like it was glowing. I wanted 60 guests. I wanted my grandmother's recipe for the dinner rolls. I wanted Marcus's mother's flowers from her garden as part of the centerpieces. I wanted the ceremony to be read by a friend of ours who had known us both for years. I spent 2.5 years making that vision real. Marcus helped with a lot of it. His family was warm and engaged in a way that still surprised me sometimes. His mother, Evelyn, called me regularly to check in on how things were going. His sisters offered to help address invitations. His father asked me every time he saw me whether there was anything he could do. I learned to accept that kind of support gracefully, but it always had a faint quality of strangeness to it, because it was not what I was used to. My parents' involvement in the wedding planning was limited. They came to the venue walkthrough and said it was beautiful. They came to one of the caterer tastings and said the food was good. They did not offer to help in specific ways, and I did not ask because I had learned a long time ago that asking my parents for specific help with specific things led to either vague promises that dissolved or to conversations that somehow ended up being about something else entirely. So I did not ask. I did the planning with Marcus and with his family and with my best friend Simone, who threw herself into the process with an enthusiasm that made me feel genuinely loved. I sent my parents the save the date 8 months in advance. I sent the formal invitation 4 months out. I texted my mother a reminder 6 weeks before the date and got back a heart emoji and the message, "Can't wait, sweetie." I took that as confirmation. I had no reason to think otherwise. 3 weeks before the wedding, Danny announced a barbecue. This was not a special occasion barbecue. It was not a birthday, not a graduation, not an anniversary of anything. It was a backyard cookout that Danny decided to throw because summer was winding down and he wanted to have people over. He sent out a group text to the family on a Thursday afternoon. The date he chose was the same Saturday as my wedding. I found out because my mother texted me that Friday, the day after Danny's group text went out. She said, "Patty, I need to talk to you about something. Your father and I are in a bit of a bind." I called her back immediately. She told me that Danny had planned this cookout. She used the word planned, which was generous given that he had announced it 48 hours earlier and that a lot of family was already going. She told me that she and my father were worried about missing Danny's event because he had specifically mentioned how much it would mean to him if his family showed up. She said, "You know how Danny gets when he feels like people aren't supporting him." I sat very still. I remember the quality of the silence in my apartment in that moment. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a car outside. I said, "Mom, my wedding is that Saturday, my wedding." She said, "I know, sweetheart, I know, but your wedding has Marcus's family there. Danny only has us." And I thought about all the years I had minimized and explained and absorbed and stayed quiet, and I said, "Mom, I need you to come to my wedding." She said she would talk to my father and call me back. She called me back 2 hours later and said they were going to try to come for part of the reception. They would miss the ceremony because the drive timing was complicated, but they would come for part of the reception. I said okay. I said okay because I did not know what else to say. I did not tell Marcus that night. I did not tell anyone that night. I sat on my couch alone and thought about the fact that 3 weeks before my wedding, my parents had just told me they were going to miss my ceremony to attend a barbecue. Not a funeral, not a medical emergency, not something that had been planned for Aunts, a backyard cookout that my cousin had thrown together in 2 days because he felt like it. I told Marcus the next morning. He went very quiet in the way he goes quiet when something truly shocks him. Then he said, "Patricia, that is not okay." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you want me to call them?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you want to call them again yourself?" I said I did not think it would change anything. He said, "What do you want to do?" And I said I wanted to keep planning our wedding and not let this ruin it. He looked at me for a long time and then he said, "Okay, and I love you and we are going to have an incredible wedding." And I held on to that. I did not call my parents again to argue. I did not send a long message. I said nothing more about it and let them believe I had accepted their plan to arrive late for the reception. But something had shifted inside me. Something I had been carrying for a very long time had reached its weight limit and I could feel it. I could not have described it precisely at that point, but it was there. A kind of quiet settling, like a decision making itself without my full participation. The week before the wedding was a blur. Simone flew in from Seattle and threw herself into helping with last-minute details. Marcus's family arrived in waves, his parents first, then his sisters, and the warmth they carried with them was almost physical. His mother, Evelyn, hugged me for a long time on the Thursday before the wedding and said, "We are so happy to be here, Patricia. We are so happy for both of you." I had to look away for a second because the kindness of it caught me off guard in a way that sometimes still happened, even after years of knowing this family. My parents texted me the Wednesday before the wedding to say they were looking forward to Saturday. I responded with a thumbs up. I was not interested in a longer conversation. Simone noticed the exchange and asked me what was going on. I told her the whole thing, all of it, not just the barbecue situation but the long history underneath it, and she listened without interrupting and then said, "Patricia, I have wanted to say something about your parents for about 6 years." I said, "I know." She said, "I love you." I said, "I know that too." Saturday morning came clear and warm. The kind of September day that feels like a gift, where the light has that particular quality that makes everything look deliberate. I got ready in a room at the venue with Simone and Marcus's sisters, and we laughed and fussed with hair and drank too much sparkling water, and I felt genuinely happy in a way that sat alongside the other thing I was carrying. The two feelings did not cancel each other out. They existed together, and I let them. At 11:15, 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I sent my mother a text. It said, "We are starting soon. Are you almost here?" She responded 11 minutes later at 11:26 with, "We are at Danny's, sweetie." It ran long. "We will head your way when we can. Love you." They were still at the barbecue. The ceremony had not even started yet and they were still at the barbecue. I looked at that text for a moment and then I put my phone face down on the dressing table and I walked to the window and looked out at the field behind the venue where the wildflowers were still going even in September, and I breathed. Simone came and stood next to me. She did not say anything. She just stood there and I was grateful for that. At 11:30, I walked down the aisle. The venue was exactly what I had pictured. The string lights made the barn glow even in daylight. Marcus's father walked me down the aisle because I had asked him 3 weeks earlier before I fully understood why I was asking him. He held my arm with both hands and walked slowly, and I looked straight ahead at Marcus, who was standing at the end of the aisle with tears already going and a smile that made everything else smaller. I did not look at the two empty chairs in the front row until the ceremony was over. I saw them in my peripheral vision the whole time, but I did not look directly at them. I looked at Marcus. I looked at the friend who was reading our vows. I looked at the 60 people in that barn who had chosen to be there, who had arranged their lives around this specific day, who had driven hours and taken time off work and wrapped gifts and found their seats and waited with warmth for this moment. I married Marcus with those 60 people as my witnesses, and the two empty chairs in the front row were what they were. My parents arrived at 2:40 in the afternoon, more than 2 hours after the ceremony ended. The reception was fully underway. People were dancing. The dinner had been served. My grandmother's dinner rolls, the exact ones from the recipe I had hunted down, had already been passed around and finished off and praised. My parents walked into the reception as though they were arriving on time, greeting people they knew, kissing cheeks, helping themselves to the drinks table. My father found me near the dance floor and hugged me and said, "You look gorgeous, Patty, just gorgeous." My mother hugged me and said, "The venue is beautiful. You did such a good job." I smiled, I said thank you. I introduced them to the people standing nearby. I was very calm. I want to be honest about that calmness because I think it confused people later who expected me to make a scene. I did not make a scene. I was not going to make a scene at my own wedding, but the calmness was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was not the quiet of someone who had let something go. It was the quiet of someone who had finally, fully, and completely decided something. Marcus stayed close to me for the rest of the reception. He knew. He watched my parents work the room with the easy comfort of people who had done nothing wrong, and he kept his hand on my back and said nothing because he understood that this was not the moment for words. The moment for words was going to come, but it was not at our wedding reception. My parents stayed for about 90 minutes. They danced once, posed for photos, and then told me they needed to head back because Danny was wrapping up and they wanted to say goodbye to everyone. I nodded. I said, "Drive safe." My mother hugged me again and said, "I'm so happy for you, sweetheart." And I said thank you, and I meant it in the most limited possible way. After they left, Simone came and found me. She said, "How are you?" I said, "I am married and I love my husband and the dinner rolls were perfect and I am going to be okay." She said, "And your parents?" I said, "That is a different conversation for a different day." She nodded. She poured me a glass of champagne and we went back to the dance floor and I danced with Marcus until my feet hurt, and that was my wedding day. The different day came about 2 weeks later. Marcus and I had returned from a short honeymoon, 4 days at a cabin by a lake because that was what we wanted, quiet and simple and ours. We came home rested and clear-headed and deeply in agreement about what we needed to address. We had talked about my parents on the honeymoon carefully and at length. Marcus was not a man who pushed for confrontation, but he was also not a man who believed in letting things fester without acknowledgement. He asked me what I wanted, not what I thought I should do, not what the family would expect, not what would keep the peace, what I wanted. I told him I wanted clarity. I wanted to say out loud to my parents what the reality of what they had done was, not to punish them, not to start a war, but because I was done carrying the gap between what they said about family and what they actually chose when it mattered. I was done letting the gap exist without naming it. Marcus said, "Then we do that," and he meant we, and I knew it. I called my parents on a Tuesday evening and asked if they could come for dinner on Saturday. My mother sounded pleased. She said, "Of course, how sweet, we'd love that." I said, "Great, 7 o'clock." She said, "Should I bring anything?" I said, "Just yourselves." They arrived Saturday with a bottle of wine and the easy energy of people who believed this was a normal post-wedding dinner. Marcus and I had cooked a real meal. The table was set. Everything looked like a pleasant evening. And for the first 40 minutes it was. We ate and talked about the honeymoon and the cabin and the lake, and my father asked Marcus about a project at work, and my mother admired the new rug we had gotten for the living room. After the plates were cleared, I set down my water glass and said, "I want to talk about the wedding." My mother's expression did not change immediately. She said, "What about it?" I said, "You weren't at the ceremony." My father said, "We explained that, Patty. The timing was complicated." I said, "Dad, you were at Danny's barbecue during my ceremony. Not at a hospital, not at a funeral, not dealing with an emergency. You were at a cookout while I walked down the aisle." My mother started to say something about how Danny really needed the support, and I said, "Mom, please stop for a moment." I had rehearsed this in my head many times. I had thought about it on long walks and in quiet moments before sleep. I knew that if I got emotional or loud, my parents would use that to reframe the conversation as Patricia overreacting. I had seen them do it before, not with me specifically, but with other people in the family who had tried to confront them about something they did not want to look at. They were skilled at the pivot. I was not going to give them the pivot. I said, "I am not angry right now. I want you to understand that. I am not having this conversation because I want an apology that will make everything okay. I am having this conversation because I need you to understand what happened. You have spent most of my life making choices that put other people ahead of me. I have watched it for 31 years. I have tried to understand it, to minimize it, to tell myself I was exaggerating. I am done doing that. On my wedding day, the 2 chairs I reserved for you in the front row were empty. I walked down the aisle without you there because you were at a barbecue. That is not a complicated timing issue. That is a choice, and it tells me something very clear about where I stand." My father was quiet. My mother's eyes filled. She said, "Patty, we had no idea you felt this way. And this is the sentence that I had been expecting because it is the sentence that people say when they want to locate the problem inside your feelings rather than inside their actions. I said, Mom, this is not about how I feel. This is about what you did. Feelings and facts are two different things. The fact is that you missed my wedding ceremony for a barbecue. Whatever I feel about that is secondary to the fact itself. My father said, we thought you would understand. You have Marcus, you have his family, Danny only has us. I looked at my father for a long moment, then I said, Danny is 33 years old. He threw an unplanned backyard cookout. I was getting married, and you thought that was a comparable situation. He did not answer, he looked at the table. My mother said, we love you just as much as we love Danny. I said, I know you believe that, but love and priority are not the same thing. If you love two people equally and you have to choose between their needs, the choice you make tells them something real. You have made that choice my entire life, and it has always landed the same way. I am not asking you to stop loving Danny. I am telling you that the pattern of choices you have made has done real damage, and I am not going to pretend it hasn't. There was a long silence. Then my father said, what do you want from us? And I said, I want you to understand what I just said. I am not asking for a performance of regret. I am not asking you to suddenly prioritize me over everyone else. I am asking you to be honest with yourselves about what your choices have communicated to me over the years. And I am telling you that going forward, I am going to operate with that history clearly in mind. I am going to love you because you are my parents. But I am done spending energy chasing something I have never fully had. My mother cried. My father got very formal and quiet in the way he does when he is uncomfortable. They left earlier than planned. The drive home must have been a difficult one. I did not call to check. In the weeks after that dinner, my parents made a few attempts to reopen the conversation in ways that would have ended with me reassuring them that everything was fine. My mother sent a long text about how much she loved me and how she hoped we could move forward. My father called and left a voicemail saying he had been thinking about what I said and he was sorry things had felt that way. I want you to notice the language there. He was sorry things had felt that way. Not that he was sorry for what he did, sorry for how it had felt. That gap in language is not accidental. It is how people apologize without actually acknowledging that they did something that needed apologizing for. I responded to both with short, warm messages. I said I appreciated them reaching out. I said I loved them. I did not say that everything was fine because everything was not fine and I was no longer willing to say it was when it was not. This was new behavior for me and it felt unfamiliar in a way that was both uncomfortable and deeply right. Then something happened that changed the external landscape of what had, until that point, been primarily a private family wound. My parents' choice to attend Danny's barbecue had not gone unnoticed by others in the family. Families are observation networks, and the observation had been particularly acute in this case because Marcus's family was present at the wedding and several of them knew my parents well enough to notice the two empty chairs and ask questions. Marcus's Aunt Roberta was a woman of a certain directness that I had come to deeply appreciate. She had sat in the second row at our ceremony and had seen those empty chairs and had, in the way of people who do not compartmentalize things quietly, mentioned it to someone. That someone had mentioned it to someone else. The social consequence was not catastrophic or public in a dramatic sense, but it was real. People in the extended family network were aware. Some of them had opinions. Danny, it turned out, was also aware. He called me about a month after the wedding. This surprised me because Danny and I did not have a particularly close relationship. We were cordial in the way of cousins who have always been in the same orbit without ever genuinely choosing each other. He sounded uncomfortable on the phone. He said, Pat, I heard there was some stuff going on about my party and your wedding. I said, they're double. As overlap in the dates, yes. He said, I didn't know your wedding was that day when I planned the party. This was, at minimum, interesting. The family group text with my wedding date had existed for months. Save the dates had gone out 8 months prior. Whether Danny had genuinely not registered the overlap or whether he was telling me what he needed to say, I could not be certain. I said, I appreciate you calling. He said, I didn't want anyone to think I caused a problem. I said, Danny, I do not blame you for planning a party on the same day as my wedding. I blame my parents for choosing which one to attend. He was quiet for a moment and then said, yeah, that's fair, I guess it is. It was the most honest exchange Danny and I had ever had. I gave him credit for making the call. What I did not anticipate was that within the extended family, the wedding situation had opened a conversation about patterns that some people had been sitting with for a long time. My Aunt Carol, Danny's mother, reached out to my mother with some version of what I can only imagine was a complicated conversation. My mother's sister Linda, who I had always been somewhat close to, called me to say she wanted me to know she thought what my parents had done was wrong and that she was sorry it had happened. That call meant more to me than she probably knew. My parents, for their part, were in the uncomfortable position of having their choice witnessed and assessed by people whose opinions they cared about. In the internal hierarchy of family reputation, being seen as someone who missed their daughter's wedding for a barbecue did not reflect the way they wanted to be seen. They had spent 31 years believing they were good parents, and that belief was now being quietly challenged by people around them. My mother called me about 6 weeks after the wedding. It was a different kind of call. She did not begin with reassurances or pivots. She started the call by saying, I have been doing a lot of thinking. I sat down. She said, I want to apologize to you, Patricia, not for how things felt, for what we did. She paused. She said, "We made the wrong choice. I know that now. I knew it when I sent that text, if I am being honest. I knew it was wrong. I went anyway." I asked her why. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I think was the first truly honest thing she had said to me about this dynamic in my entire life. She said, "Because with Danny, there is always urgency. Even when it is not real urgency, it feels urgent. And with you," she paused, "with you, I always thought Patricia will be fine. Patricia doesn't need us the same way." I said, "Mom, that is exactly the problem." She said, "I know. I think I have always known, and I kept not looking at it." I sat with that for a long time after the call. I still sit with it sometimes. My mother's honesty did not fix anything. It did not rewind the 31 years or fill the empty chairs or give me the graduation ceremony they missed or undo the endless small moments when I had been the footnote in my own family's story. But it was real. It was the first time she had said something true about the pattern rather than defending it. That matters, not everything, but something. In the months that followed, I made deliberate choices about the relationship I was going to have with my parents going forward. I did not cut them off. I did not send a dramatic letter of estrangement. I did not make pronouncements about consequences. What I did was quieter and more permanent than any of those things. I decided to let the relationship become exactly what it had always actually been, rather than what I had worked so hard to pretend it was. This meant I stopped initiating. For years, I had been the one who called, who organized, who made sure the relationship kept moving. I stopped doing that, not out of punishment, but out of honesty. If my parents wanted a relationship with me, they were going to have to want it actively. I was not going to carry the momentum of connection alone anymore. The first few weeks, I noticed the silence. Nothing terrible happened. The relationship simply reflected its actual weight. My parents began to call more, slowly at first, then with more regularity. My mother started checking in on things she had never asked about before. She asked about my work, about projects I was working on, about things Marcus and I were doing. It was imperfect. It was sometimes clumsy, but it was more than it had been. Something else changed too, and this part I had not expected. Marcus and I, in the process of building the life we were building, had started to experience genuine success. My freelance design work, which I had been building on the side of my full-time job for 3 years, had grown enough that I was able to leave my job and work independently. This was not instant wealth. It was not dramatic. It was the result of years of quiet, consistent work, but it meant that Marcus and I owned our lives in a way we had not before. We moved into a house. We started building equity. We made plans that were real. My parents noticed. My father started asking Marcus questions about investment and property in a way he had never engaged with me about before. My mother began dropping hints about family gatherings in a new way, about wanting us to come, about how nice it would be to spend time together. I was not cynical about this. I understood that people's attention tracks with perceived success, and I had no interest in weaponizing that. But I was also watching it with clear eyes. One particular moment stands out. It was about 8 months after the wedding. My parents called together on speaker, which was unusual enough that I knew something specific was coming. They told me that Danny was in a difficult situation. He had started the catering business, the one that had been the topic of the dinner the night I announced my engagement, and it had not gone well. He owed money to a supplier. He needed a loan. They were asking if Marcus and I might be able to help. I want to describe how I handled this moment because I think it is the clearest illustration of who I had become versus who I used to be. The old Patricia would have felt the guilt immediately, would have thought about how to say no without damaging the relationship, would have worried about being seen as unhelpful or selfish, would have possibly said yes to something that was not her responsibility because the alternative felt too painful. The Patricia who answered that call said, "I love you both and I'm not able to do that." I said it simply, without a long explanation, without an apology, without an alternative offer to soften the decline. My mother said, "Oh, Patty, it would just be a loan." I said, "I understand, and I'm not able to." My father said, "Danny is family." I said, "I know he is, and I'm not able to loan him money." There was a pause. I said, "Is there anything else I can help with?" They said no. I said I loved them, and we hung up. I sat in my kitchen after that call and felt something I had not expected to feel: peace. Not triumph, not satisfaction in a sharp or bitter way, just peace. The clean, simple feeling of a person who had said what was true for them without apology or drama and had not been destroyed by it. Marcus came into the kitchen and saw my face. He said, "They asked, didn't they?" I said, "Yes." He said, and I said no. He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Honestly, really, really okay." Over the following year, the relationship with my parents continued to evolve. They were not transformed into different people. My father still had a tendency to talk about Danny with a particular kind of warmth that had its own texture. My mother still sometimes redirected conversations toward other family members in ways I recognized. They were who they were, but something had changed in the architecture of the relationship, and that change was durable. The change was this: I had stopped pretending. I had stopped pretending the dynamic was equal when it was not. I had stopped pretending the choices they made were without meaning. I had stopped pretending that I needed their validation in order to know my own worth. And because I had stopped pretending, there was an honesty in our interactions that had never existed before. It was not always comfortable, but it was real. My mother told me about a year after the wedding that she had started talking to a therapist. She said it in a casual way, as though mentioning she had started taking a new vitamin. I said, "That's great, Mom." She said, "It's helping me think about some things." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "She helped me see some things about how I handled you growing up that I wish I had done differently." I said, "I appreciate you telling me that." She said, "I just wanted you to know." And that was all. No dramatic confession, no tearful reckoning. Just a small piece of honesty offered simply and accepted simply. Marcus and I have been married for almost 2 years now as I tell you this story. Our life is not perfect. No one's life is. We have had our own arguments, our own periods of strain, our own things to work through. But we have built something that feels genuinely ours, grounded in the kind of honesty and mutual respect that I had not always known was available to me. Marcus still holds my hand when we watch things that are sad. He still remembers the small things I mention. He still shows up. My parents come to dinner sometimes. They are better than they were in ways that matter. My father told me recently that he was proud of my business. He said it directly without segue, without a pivot to someone else. He just said, "Patricia, I want you to know I am really proud of what you have built." And I looked at him and said, "Thank you, Dad. That means something to me." And it did, not because I needed it the way I once needed it, but because it was real, and real things always mean something, even when you have learned to live without them. I think about those two empty chairs sometimes. Not as often as I once did, but sometimes. I think about the version of me who sat in the venue dressing room reading that text, still at Danny's, sweetie, and made the choice to keep her phone face down and walk down the aisle anyway. I am proud of that woman, not because she was tough, but because she chose her own joy over her own devastation on a day that was supposed to be about joy, and she did not let anyone else's absence take that from her. The chairs being empty was not the end of anything. It was actually a beginning. It was the moment when I finally, clearly, and permanently understood that I had been waiting for something from my parents that they did not know how to give freely. I had been waiting for them to choose me the way they chose other people. And the clarity of that wedding day, the clarity of that text message, those two empty chairs, the unmistakable arithmetic of their priorities, gave me something I had not had before. It gave me the freedom to stop waiting. Stopping waiting does not mean stopping loving. I love my parents, I believe they love me, but love without consistent choosing is not the same thing as love that shows up. I have learned to love them for what they can offer, to receive that with genuine gratitude, and to get the rest from the people in my life who give it freely. Marcus, Simone, his family, the handful of true friends who have been the family I built deliberately with open eyes. If you are someone who recognizes Patricia's story in your own, I want to say something directly to you. You are not wrong for noticing. You are not oversensitive for hurting. You are not selfish for wanting to be chosen. The work is not learning to want less. The work is learning to stop chasing what is not coming and to receive what is actually being offered from the people who offer it freely and from yourself. You are allowed to name the pattern. You are allowed to stop carrying it alone. You are allowed to build a life that does not orbit around the approval of people who have never quite made you the center. Patricia learned that, not overnight, not without pain, but she learned it and she kept it, and it changed everything. If Patricia's story brought something up for you, if you have ever sat in a room waiting for someone who chose to be somewhere else, if you have ever minimized your own hurt to protect people who were not protecting you, drop a comment and tell me about a moment when you finally stopped waiting. Not the dramatic moment, the quiet one. The moment when something settled inside you and you understood that you were done. I read every comment. Patricia's journey continues, and so does yours.